Hades 2, the long-awaited sequel of the wonderful Hades 1, is finally been out for a few months now, and I got to finally play it more than just a few runs. I've pretty much completed the full game, and as someone who spedrun and 100% of the first game, I actually have a lot to talk about. Does this game actually live up to the expectation, to the hype? Let's talk about it. I actually was playing this game in early access. I was following the early access quite closely. I started playing when it first came out. I'm not even sure, like 1 to 2 years ago. And I've been following every single update since. And then I just took a break from the last update into the full release. And I only got to play it recently. So my experience is a little bit different because I got to see a lot of the early stuff and I got to see the game change and expand. And when I finally started playing the full release, I already have a save file. I didn't want to start over because I had put in a lot of hours already. So the pacing in my experience is going to be different, but I will say I think they did a really, really good job for returning players as well, because it didn't feel completely confusing or messed up in terms of the story, lore, plot, pacing kind of stuff. It still felt like I was experiencing the game kind of from the start, even though I had a pretty beefy save file already. And as I said, I was a massive fan of the first game. I think the first game did a lot of things extremely well, was a great blend of gameplay with interesting pacing, with an awesome hub that really pushed players to get meta progression and to really fall in love with a lot of characters. And since then, I think that Hades 1 did actually push the roguelike indie action community in a different direction thanks to it, because now a lot of people want to do, similar things to Hades because it did so well. But the thing about Hades is that it's not an easy game to replicate. It's not like a Survivor-like, for instance, where if you just replicate the gameplay, you pretty much can create your own little Survivor-like game. But when it comes to Hades, what makes Hades so great is this blend of a lot of content and work put into the immersion, the characters, the voice acting, the story, and of course all the roguelike elements, which are also quite extensive. And I'm proud to say that Hades 2 pretty much kept all of it. And I would even go beyond that and say that I think they've improved on a lot of the stuff, even though the first game was close to perfect in my eyes. All right, let's talk gameplay. The gameplay is fairly similar, but definitely has a few twists from the first game. It's still a fairly traditional action roguelike game where there's a lot of work put into the core gameplay elements. So you can dash, you have your dash strike, you have your attack, you have your special, you can omega these two, and you also have your cast. You can also omega. You can find an ultimate ability, which is called the Hex. So in its core, the game already is quite extensive, same as the first game. The big difference from the first game here is that I would say that everything is kind of just like turned up a little bit in complexity. You now have omegas, which means you can charge up any of these core gameplay elements and have a different ability. It's not just like purely better, it's just sometimes different. And so you have to adjust to knowing when to use omegas, when not to, and how to use them. And these use mana, and they added mana in this game, and that was a risky move, I will say, because adding mana is not always the most fun thing. It's pretty much just saying that now we're adding more elements, but you're restricted, right? Restricting players is not always the safest move to make your fast-paced action roguelike game. But in this instance, after all the early access stuff, I think they've actually really made it a good balance of not being too frustrating, but still having to be aware of your mana to be able to play correctly. Another noticeable difference from the first game, obviously, is the fact that you're not double dashing all over the place anymore. You just have a single dash and then you can run. And the running is also a new element to the game. There are some boons that are going to affect your sprint, and you kind of play around with that. And that means that I think the game is, a little bit harder to get used to, because you can't just be double dashing all over the place and evading everything kind of easily. Here you have to be a little bit more selective with your dash, even though you can still use your dash very frequently. In my eyes, I think Hades 2 is more complex at the start and does feel harder to get OP runs, but once you're really comfortable with the game, I think you can create even more powerful runs than in Hades 1. And I think the game has this awesome way of being kind of unbalanced, but the right way of unbalanced, where the game rewards you. If you understand how to play this game correctly and you really understand all the intricacies, you can pretty much consistently feel overpowered every single run, even at a higher difficulty, which instead of being heat, it's fear in this game. This game is so rewarding. Now I'm consistently doing fear like 15 to 20, and I've been on a win streak for a while, and every single run feels so amazing. And I guess that circles into another conversation, which is that, each run is super unique. That was one of the great things of the first game. There was a lot of different things to start your runs with, between your keepsake, your different weapons, a different aspect, the different boons you could find. And yeah, same deal here, and even more so, I would say. Now that there's few more things to play with, that means there's even more possibilities to create unique things. Each weapon feels very different. Each aspect can feel drastically different from the last as well. The keepsake, I think, are even more interesting than the first game. Again, they're more complicated overall, I would say, but they allow even more interesting runs. In the first game, once you got really comfortable, you pretty much always knew which keepsakes to go for. But here, even after having played for about 70 hours or so, every now and then, I'm not too sure which keepsake to go for because there's so many interesting possibilities, and I love that. Let's talk about the actual roguelike run themselves. There are 2 paths, which is crazy. You can go above or under, and that's completely different biomes, completely different bosses. It's just a different game. It feels like a DLC. It feels like the top path is a DLC, and it really felt that way for me, more so than most people, I think, because I got to play, again, the early access, where for about a year we didn't have access to the top path. And when that came out, I was like, oh my goodness, that is just an entire new possible branch for a run. That's so insane with the amount of content that a game like Hades have, that they decide to go for another path entirely. New biome, new, oh my god, that just still blows my mind. In any case, they're both really interesting, and the game kind of pushes you to try to balance having to go up and down depending on the materials that you need to craft certain elements in the hub, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But in terms of the roguelike elements, the boons, again, I'm really impressed with the design of the new gods, because when you do a sequel and you keep the same kind of concepts from your first game, it tends to be really hard to come up with brand new ideas, because naturally, you know, the first game already had a lot of these ideas. If you're gonna make a new god, right, you can't just have the same kind of effect, right? If you're gonna have Zeus and you want something different, then you gotta come up with something different, which you didn't put in your first game. And I've got to say, a lot of them, surprisingly, are not too complicated, quote unquote, for the most part, and they're all really interesting. So awesome job on the gods. I think they're sometimes even more interesting than the first game, which is hard to do for a sequel. The biomes themselves, you're always going through the same one, but there's so much diversity in terms of what you can find that doesn't feel repetitive, and heck, you've got 2 paths now. The bosses you face are really, really cool, really interesting, especially when you get that upgraded boss version from the Fear Testament, I forgot what they're called. They're super cool. And I think, overall, I feel like you can find more boons than in the first game. That might just be psychological, and if so, that means they made it so that it feels that way, to me at least. But I really do appreciate the fact that, I can find a lot more boons, or at least I feel like I have so many boons by the end of a run, and it's so enjoyable because, once again, the boon combination is what makes the run so enjoyable. You can create your own synergies. It's up to you sometimes to figure out that, like maybe a freeze effect plus a weak thing is gonna make it more comfortable for me to get close to enemies and then trigger my close range boons more efficiently because now they're frozen. These kind of things, are not like inherently like the game tells you to do that, but you yourself come up with your own synergies. And I think this is a game that really, really, really pushes that a whole lot. I'm constantly coming up with new combinations of boons that I realize actually that makes a lot of sense. And the fact that the game doesn't inherently tell me to do it and I come up with it is very satisfying. And I think it's an aspect that makes a lot of modern roguelikes so enjoyable, is when you have that kind of feeling. I want to touch on a little bit on the hex. The hex I was a little mixed about. I remember that in the early access, I wasn't really a fan of them. So the hexes are kind of like they replace the call in the first game. There's a particular god that can give you a hex, and it's kind of like an ultimate that you have to build up by using mana. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think they're kind of whatever to me. I don't love them that much because they're harder to synergize with other things. And I think that overall, anything that doesn't synergize easily with your core mechanics is not something that I find interesting. That's why the hexes are a little meh to me, but I think they did a much better job at making them feel a little bit more interesting in the full release, considering that now you're going to be using your mana much more consistently, even if you're not going for Omega builds. There's usually always a way to use mana somehow, at least in my experience. I do kind of wish there were more hexes because you always see the same ones, and I think that could have been an interesting addition considering the game already has so much content. But hey, I'm just greedy. All right, let's talk about the hub. Obviously, Hades 1 had a big emphasis on the characters, the hub, and everything in between the runs themselves. And even more so in this game. I think they added a lot more things to do in the hub. You have a lot more currencies, quote unquote, a lot more materials, a lot more crafting things. And I will say sometimes it can get a little confusing, knowing what to get where and when. Like, you can't find that information around. Sometimes, you know, you're trying to craft something and you're not too sure where to get it. You could find that, but there is a lot in this game, so I could understand if it can be potentially a little confusing. The reason I'm not too sure is because, once again, since I had the early access, things were introduced to me a little bit slower. But from what I've heard from people that have played the game from scratch, doesn't seem to be too overwhelming. And overall, I think it really does a good job at whenever you're done with the run to at least be excited to come back and see what there is to do in the hub. The cauldron, which is where you can get a lot of these crafting stuff to, you know, enhance anything, really. There's so much you can do with the cauldron. Is constantly going to just give you more and more things to play around with, to discover. Some are cosmetic, some are actual gameplay related, some are just for the story. Not only that, of course, you've got some phenomenal actual voice acting and just conversations and lore between all the characters. As someone who works in the voice acting world, I am blown away by the amount of lines this game has. It just keeps on delivering more and more and more and more conversations. I'm like, is there more? I've done about 75 runs and I'm still every single time finding new conversations with almost everybody. It's insane. And the story, I think, is really well done. I think it's more serious in the first game, which is a pro and con for some people. I was definitely grasped by the whole premise and wanting to save my family. Without getting into spoilers, there are some story moments that were really, really exciting and interesting. Not to mention that when they released the full game, for those of you who don't know, they had a different ending in terms of the story and people didn't like it. And so they changed it. They changed the entire, actual plot of the ending because the community wasn't super satisfied. So they just brought in all the voice actors again and redid the whole segment. It's crazy. I love the indie field, and I'm really impressed with the love and care they've put into this sequel. Not to mention that visually, the game, it honestly one-upped the first one. When you talk to a character, there is even more art around the characters speaking depending on the environment, the kind of person they are, which is even more immersive. The VFX are fantastic. I mean, the first game also had incredible visuals, but my goodness, if you just forget about the first game and you take this game at face value, this is some of the most impressive visual effects I've seen in any action roguelike. The music, it's so awesome because they obviously tried to kind of quote-unquote copy the first game, and they brought the same composer, and they use the same themes, but they've modified it in a way that feels very unique while still being like, hey, this is a sequel. Some of the boss tracks are incredible, including, a boss being all about music. I love that they really put, a lot of care into the music, even more so than the first game, I would say. Obviously, I could talk about the sequel for a very long time in terms of nitpicking certain aspects of it, in terms of little details here and there. But instead, I'm going to now get into the segment which I think is going to be interesting. I'm going to talk about the things that I don't necessarily love, and probably the more controversial stuff that I have to point out. I've got 4 controversial things, or at least elements that I don't like that I wish they would change. And I'm going to go from less controversial to more controversial. So the least controversial issue I have with this game that I think I would imagine most people would as well, and I don't understand how they just didn't do anything about it, kind of blows my mind, is the fish. That's right. There's fishing. In the first game, when you would fish, you would then go to a ghost and then you would just press a button and it would just collect all your fish and give you rewards for them. And in this game that has a lot more stuff, way more content, which is incredible, they kind of forgot what to do with the fish. I know their plan was to add recipes with a certain fish and decided to scrap that. But now, if you collect fish, there's no place to just randomly get all your rewards. You have to go to the market and go into the bone exchange, which again has nothing, it doesn't feel like a fish area. And you have to click one by one, then sell all proceed. It's just one by one. And it just feels like my understanding is that most people thought that they were missing something and they're not selling their fish because they think that, wait a minute, am I supposed to just go here to get rid of my fish and that's all the fish is for? Yeah, that's all the fish is for. It's a tiny thing. Of course, all my nitpicks are tiny. I don't have many problems with the game, but I can't believe that they just haven't actually done anything with the fish. Even if it was just the same deal as just pressing a button and seeing all those rewards from all the fish collected. I loved collecting a bunch of fish in the first game, and then after like months and months of collecting, just pressing that one button and just like, oh, so satisfying. So that is a really tiny little thing that just bothers me, but it really does. All right, next we're getting into some more serious stuff here. Let's talk about the tarot cards. I have mixed feelings about the tarot card that replaces the mirror. Yes, the mirror was extremely simple in the first game, which is, again, pro and con. You know, sometimes simplicity is a good thing. And then with the tarot cards, now you have to be a bit more selective and you actually have to understand how they work and, you know, create your own builds with selecting certain things here and there. I still think it's a little clunky. I don't dislike it, but even just visually, it's a little hard to know what's going on. And I know they've massively improved the UI. Let me tell you, like when this first came out in early access, it was such a mess here. But when I'm just looking at this whole page here, I know what this is because I'm so used to it now. But, you know, if you just see this, it's a bit messy. I'm not too sure what they could do differently, and I don't think it's anything wrong. I just think maybe there was some other way to do this without being so convoluted visually. Yes, I do know that it opens up more and more as you play the game, and I did come in on full release having all of them available. But even so, even now that I know all of them, after I've been playing the game a lot, I'm still like, I don't feel like I want to experiment that much with them because it's just a bit of a mess to handle. At least that's my opinion, my controversial opinion. Next up, I want to talk about the Omega cast. I think the Omega cast and the cast themselves are a little bit off from the rest of the core mechanics. I actually like the cast. I think it's pretty cool. I think once you get used to it, it's quite nice to use and to actually fuse and synergize with other elements from your build. But the Omega cast, I think is kind of useless. And that's usually not a problem, right? Like if you have an extra element that you have to play around with, cool. You don't have to use it if you don't like to. But the problem is you're going to sometimes be offered boons that only affect your Omega cast. And when that happens, I got a feeling that most people are going to be disappointed because it just feels like a waste of boon, because I don't think most people like using the Omega cast build or just using Omega casts in general. You don't have to do a build around it. I have used Omega cast builds, which is really fun. But overall, I do feel like that if you're going to be using your mana, it's usually going to be with your attack, special, or something else. I feel like the Omega cast is so situational, it doesn't really synergize with the rest of the build as easily and requires, you know, a little bit of time and mana to create, that I think the Omega cast just does not feel like it's super fitting a lot of times. And yes, again, if you've played the game a lot, you'll get to understand, oh, well, actually, you can use your Omega cast, blah, 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 blah. I know, you can always use everything. But I think most people that start playing the game are just going to struggle understanding how to use it correctly, considering that it feels a little off from everything else. That's my point. If you disagree with all of these, then feel free to comment down below. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on it, considering that this is just with my very limited amount of impressions from friends and myself. And then lastly, this is probably the most controversial. I've gotten used to using my cast. I still think that the cast should not necessarily be forming under you by default. I think the cast should have been a lesser version of the Zeus cast where you're allowed to like kind of aim somewhere. And if I'm not mistaken, I think originally in the early access, that boon couldn't go anywhere on the screen. You had to be around you. It was just like you were able to push that cast a little bit forward or behind or just around you, but not necessarily under you. I think that's what that cast for Zeus was. And I kind of wish that that was the default. Because what ends up happening is once you're used to playing with the cast, you're going to be doing your cast, and then you're going to be dashing away. Because you don't want to be in the middle of the cast. It's a little awkward, and you want to get further away from the enemies. It's just awkward. I think it would be more fun if you could just move your cast around and have a little bit more flexibility with it without necessarily needing the boon for it. So that's probably my most controversial opinion about Hades 2. Everything else, I would say, is pretty much perfect. I think in this day and age, a bigger action roguelike needs to obviously have good balance, good design, you know, fun gameplay, but I think what really keeps a player engaged, or one of the things, is having a reason to continue to play. And I think Hades 2 has more reasons than any other roguelike I've ever played. Every time that I thought I had completed a major thing, I would then be offered a new goal, a new challenge, a new thing to discover and to go for. Getting to the true ending, obviously, you know, requires beating the top and bottom path multiple times, which is already the case with the first game, but already that kind of pushes you to just beat the final boss multiple times, which I think is really cool. But then, you know, the rivals, which was the Pact of Punishment, you know, the upgraded bosses that you can encounter, instead of just having access to all of them at once, you have to do them incrementally. You have to beat the first 2 bosses of each region, then you have to unlock the second, then you have to unlock the third, and you have to unlock the fourth, and all of that took me like 20 runs to have access to doing that. But I was so curious to see how the upgraded Chronos and the upgraded top path was going to look like, that it really got me engaged and kept me going. Same with that person who's sleeping, like all the side quests where you would get into the dream, and then like after like 30 runs you'd finally get the recipe to get deeper, and you're just so intrigued. And then all the different aspects, the hidden aspects, all the different pets, all the lore, the different keepsakes you can find. Oh my goodness, I know that this first game also had that, but here even more so, and it just keeps me wanting to play, to try to find more and more and more things, because this game has more content than any other action roguelike I could think of outside of The Binding of Isaac. So do I think this game was overhyped? No, not at all. I can't believe it, but I really do think that this is actually an improvement to the first game, and possibly the best sequel I could think of for a roguelike. I think they did everything extremely well. Once again, a bit more complicated in the first game, so I can understand if someone prefers the first game. But for someone like me, who sped on the first game, who understands these games extremely well, who loves complexity and certain gameplay mechanics and boons and stuff like that, this game was like made for me. And I think that Hades 2 has become one of my favorite roguelikes ever. And that's why it's an easy 10 out of 10 peppers for me. I mean, I think this game is an absolute masterpiece. And as someone who thought that the early access was already incredible, I thought that once the full release would be out, that there wouldn't be too much more added. But no, I was wrong. They added so much more. I was like, why? How? What? I'm so amazed. If you're interested in seeing me play this game, I will be planning on making a series where I'll be playing at Fear 0 and going up and up and up and up and up, and stopping whenever I actually die. So it's going to be a deathless win streak at increased difficulty is the plan for the next series on this channel. But yeah, that's about it.